Okay, I think we might go ahead and get started. We don't have an unlimited amount of time, unfortunately, but I want to have as much as we can for this fantastic panel. Thank you, everyone, for coming and joining us here at the virtual PopCon 2020. This is certainly, I doubt what any of us expected that we would be doing, but I'm really grateful and thankful that we're able to do something. My name's Charles Hughes. I'm the moderator for this conversation. And before we get going, just a couple of quick, businessy type things. First of all, just make sure one thing that, and I'm going to be doing this too, that if you to put yourself on mute, just to make sure that we don't have any extraneous noises coming from anybody. I know my cats are behind me and they may start meowing at any point. But and also we will save all Q&A until the end. But feel free to utilize the chat function before that if you have questions that you want to put in there and that we can get to later, or other comments. And the other stuff I was in today, people were using the comments to add not just questions, but reactions. So please feel free to utilize that. I'm going to introduce the panelists. We're going to go in order that we're in the program. And I will turn it over to them, and then we will have plenty of time, I hope, for conversation afterwards. So we will begin today with David Cantwell. David Cantwell lives in Kansas City, Missouri, and writes about popular culture for The New Yorker and for Rolling Stone Country. He was a longtime senior editor for the original incarnation of No Depression and was the 2017 winner of the Chet Flippo Award for Excellence in Country Music Journalism. He's the co-author of Heartaches by the Number, country music's 500 greatest singles, and he is working too slowly, he says, on a revised, expanded edition of his 2013 critical monograph, Merle Haggard, The Running Kind. And David will be presenting What is Youth? Country Music's Child Neglect.
Here we go. In 1970, Johnny Cash had a #3 country hit, top 20 pop, with a song he'd written called What is Truth? A talking blues, it opens with Cash voicing an evergreen old-timers complaint about kids these days and their strange music. But then Cash proceeds to caution old folks that maybe these long-haired kids with their new sounds are just trying to be heard over your noise. And the lonely voice of youth cries, what is truth? At least on radio, What is Truth was the most successful of that moment's many responses to Merle Haggard's Ogie from Muskogee. Cash underscored that dialogue when, on his TV show, he had Haggard on as a guest to sing Ogie, then performed What is Truth later in the same episode. He introduced his song by framing youthful protests as all-American free speech, maybe even in support of all-American values, and by assuring viewers these long-haired kids were good kids. Mostly. Also in 1970, country parodist Ben Colder, aka Sheb Wooley, released his tweaking of Cash's What is Truth, called What is Youth? Not an especially clever humorist, Colder got in homophobic digs mistaking long-haired boys for girls, and scatological ones mistaking smoking pot with chamber pots. What is truth? When Sheb was young, he says, truth was this old man's razor strap across his backside. So we have Merle seeming to chastise youth, who apparently don't like living right and being free. We have Johnny cautioning Merle that the youth, right or wrong, need to be heard. And we have Sheb replying to Cash, no, what the youth need is a kick in the ass. What all three of these youth-focused country records lacked was youth. The songs are all adults talking to other adults about kids these days. For the viewpoints of actual young people, as for examples of their presumably strange music, you'd have to change the station. No surprise there, country music doesn't do youth. That's changed somewhat this century. The last decade was dominated, as always, by white men approaching middle age, but in a first, these grown men play baby men on the radio. For the bulk of country music history, though, the cliche about the genre has proven true. Country music is grown-up music. Its specialty was songs about drinking and cheating, loving and dying, and work. including domestic labor, like marriage itself, supporting the family, birthing, raising, and sometimes losing children. Kids are in these songs all the time, of course, but the songs are about parental concerns. Even when country stars are young themselves, they still tend to do grown-up. New Hall of Famer Marty Stewart turned pro when he was 12, but he did it in Lester Flatt's band, the most old folks at home proponent of the most old folks at home country subgenre, bluegrass. Stewart's fellow new inductee into the Hall, Hank Jr., started out at 11, but his sets were devoted exclusively to singing his dad's decidedly mature songbook. Better-be future Hall of Famer Tanya Tucker cut her half dozen or so initial hits before she could even drive. Unlike her contemporary Michael Jackson, young Tanya avoided childlike numbers like Zippity Doo Dah or ABC. You had to know she was a teen in order to hear her youthfulness. What you heard on her records was a woman exploring adult loss by glancing back to younger days, older but wiser. Drawing grown-ass wisdom from the lessons of one's younger self is country AF. Coal Miner's Daughter, Coat of Many Colors, Mama's Hungry Eyes, Taylor Swift's 15. Even songs focused on a kid leaving home, such as Wide Open Spaces by the artist formerly known as Dixie Chicks, concludes with the mom recalling when she needed room enough to make a big mistake. It's fairly well known at this point that country revitalizes itself by incorporating elements of music once associated with youthful energy and rebellion, but long since turned familiar and old-fashioned. Country incorporated elements of minstrelsy and swing and arena rock, right on up to old-school hip-hop couplets today. Between 1969 and 75, for my favorite example, country basically just up and absorbed the by then passé first decade of rock and roll in toto. It did this via several rockers born again as country singers and via the 92 covers of rock and roll era hits I count then on the Billboard country charts. Country is where senior sounds go to enjoy active retirements. Still, country has exhibited youthful vibrancy in the innovative and paradigm-shifting senses. Youthful energy often swiped from Black musicians and styles. Just one example that I'll spend the rest of my time talking about. Honky-tonk legend Lefty Frizzell. I don't know if his music reads young today, but it did in the early 50s when he began his career as a 22-year-old. Frizzell's singing was then described breathlessly as unprecedented, unique, like something no one had ever heard, new, strange, revolutionary even. What was Lefty doing to inspire such reactions? He was singing with melisma. Lefty bent single notes here and there into polysyllables. After Frizzell's first recording session in 1950, which resulted in big but notably melisma-free country hits, like I Love You a Thousand Ways and If You've Got the Money, I've Got the Time, Lefty passed the time till his next session managing a small club in Dallas. The club came with, per Frizzell biographer Daniel Cooper, quote, a working jukebox stoked with race records. He spent months with his life and career on hold, spinning the likes of Ivory Joe Hunter's I Almost Lost My Mind, end quote. Now, Cooper doesn't do anything with that, really. He just mentions it, but I want to do something with it. That smash by Ivory Joe aside, we don't know what specific platters were in that machine. What we do know is that it was at just this mid-century moment when the note-bending curlicues of Black gospel were finding their way like never before onto the hits crowding R&B jukeboxes in 1950, like the one Lefty was listening to. And we know something else too. When Frizzell finished binging those race records and returned to the studio in 51, his previously melisma-less singing style now included the taffy twisting of key words that became his vocal signature. Like so many country singers since, it was Lefty's distinctive adoption of Black style that made him sound so thrilling, so daring, and, as he melismatically serenaded the old folks he loved in Mom and Dad's Waltz, so young. Still, even the young and exciting Lefty didn't do youth very often. More often, He sang grown-up country laments like, I'm an old, old man trying to live while I can. He recorded that one at the ripe old age of 24. That's it.
All right. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
I love the mix of the Zoom thing where you have some people doing the visual clap, then you've got the icon of the clap. It's a wonderful analog digital. We got a thumbs up now. Excellent. It's all happening. All right. And as I said, we'll do Q&A and conversation at the end. So please, if you have thoughts about that, get ready to share them. All right. Next up, we have Julie Height. Julie is a music critic and journalist based in Nashville, who frequently maps the landscape of country and roots-leaning music for National Public Radio and NPR Music, the New York Times, and Vulture. She was the inaugural recipient of the Chet Flippo Award for Excellence in Country Music Journalism, and Height is the author of Right by Her Roots, Americana Women and Their Songs, and she will be offering today Baby You a Song, the arrival of country pop's young macho accent. Julie Height.
This is really the antithesis of what David was describing Lefty Frizzell doing. This is not so distinctive or personality-filled performances. But I'm doing this critical karaoke style, so it'll be short and sweet. I give you the sound of young, white, country dude, extreme confidence coming on Casually Strong circa 2012.
Baby, you a song, you make me wanna roll my windows down and cruise.
This was, of course, when Florida Georgia Line crystallized the bro country affect. Those brawny, rural repping performances attempting to layer suaveness over swagger. The adoption of the sound capped off a gradual shift away from the perception of country as grown folks music that spoke to carrying on and cutting loose beneath the weight of adult realities. This template wasn't reliant on storytelling, conveying emotion, or shrewd interpretation. It was about creating a musical pocket for the feel of free and easy fratty forwardness. But there was craft involved. This is a tightly written song. FGL's Tyler Hubbard and Brian Kelly were two of Cruise's 5 writers, and the rhythmic pattern they created with the lyrics was at least as important as the words themselves. Not only did they rhyme the words at the ends of phrases, they made sure to match the sounds and accents of certain syllables within lines to create simple, emphatic syncopation. Listen to all the slant rhyme in the second verse alone. Sippin' and singin', Southern and Tucker, right up in my truck. The hook has slick pop precision, despite the fact that Hubbard, the de facto lead singer, has what we would think of as a hard country vocal attack with a pronounced twang. There's very little ornamentation. He's just trying to hit the notes dead on with the assistance of auto-tune. And the doubling of his voice combined with Kelly's harmonies yields shiny metallic evenness. They were helped in their pursuit of precision by the fact that the melodic pattern stays in a range that's comfortable for them and mostly moves up or down in small stair steps, avoiding the dramatic gesture of a big leap in intervals. The sing-song effect resembles a speech pattern. They deliver cocky come-ons pretty much like they'd say them. It's obvious that they took cues from hip-hop writing techniques and cadences, at least on a superficial level. To be clear, we're talking about functional fluency here, the borrowing of what FGL and their new metal school producer Joey Moy felt made their country swagger feel more with it. For the remix, which you're hearing now, they enlisted Nelly, who'd been down the country collaboration road before and didn't have to get too far away from his wheelhouse to meet them where they were. The pop crossover success of this version, with its booming programmed drums and Nelly feature, wasn't something FGL's peers could count on replicating, but the elements of the sound became a go-to formula for male country acts across a range of ages to telegraph youthful virility with fairly low stakes in terms of what they needed to bring to a performance vocally. You know, because cruise control was available. That's it.
All right. Thank you, Julie. And thank you, Florida Georgia Line. Never thought I would say thank you, Florida Georgia Line in a public setting, but hey, there you go. All right. So next up, we have Amanda Marie Martinez. Amanda Marie Martinez is a PhD candidate in history at the University of California, Los Angeles, where she is completing a dissertation on race and the marketing practices of the country music industry from the 70s through the 90s. I can say with some certainty that this is a game changer, this work, so be ready for this. Her writing has also appeared in the Journal of Popular Music Studies and will appear in the journal California History. And today, Amanda Marie Martinez brings us Suburban Struggle, Conflict Between Punks and Urban Cowboys in Early 1980s Costa Mesa, California.
Thanks, Charles. I'm going to be giving a very abbreviated version of this paper. So here we go. In the early 1980s, country music fans and punk rockers frequently clashed in a parking lot in the suburbs south of LA, in the Orange County community of Costa Mesa, California. And this is a clash that's famously documented in the Vandals song, Urban Struggle. I'm not going to play it today because we're so tight on time, but if you haven't heard it, I definitely recommend listening to it. The site of this conflict sat between two nightclubs in Costa Mesa, the Cuckoo's Nest, the region's leading venue for hardcore punk, and Zuby's, a pizza parlor which attracted country music listeners and followers of the urban cowboy fad that dominated popular culture at the time. The urban cowboy craze shared its name with the film of the same name, Urban Cowboy, that starred John Travolta and was released in the summer of 1980 and was defined by a time when Western wear fashion and country music sales soared to new and dominating heights, and also reached its peak in late 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected president. At the time, the fad was interpreted as the perfect cultural complement to the more conservative turn the country took with Reagan's election. More than a simple culture clash, the conflict between country music fans and punk rockers in Orange County represented a moment when two uniquely suburban and Southern California sounds collided at a significant point of transition in American politics and culture, and at heart revealed a conflict over the merits of suburban life. Whereas hardcore punk rock had emerged in late 1970s Orange County as a direct challenge to suburban conformity, country music listeners in this same community celebrated suburbanism. Though both punks and suburban cowboys, as some punks call them, were known to initiate violence, several reports indicated that one side was the more common instigator. Quote, "It's the Okies," explained one onlooker, adding that they gawk at the punks, call them names, get into fisticuffs with them. Yeah, they generally start a lot of the problems. Now, while this summation suggested that country music fans were mostly to blame for this conflict, it also highlighted the enduring legacy of Okie migrant culture in Southern California. By 1980, this culture, represented by an achievement of social mobility, pride in suburban homeownership, and political and cultural conservatism, was well entrenched and protected in Orange County. As such, community leaders in Costa Mesa worked with country music fans in a mutual effort to preserve the status quo and to suppress the resistance to the region's cultural and political conservatism that came with the rise of hardcore punk rock, which led to the Cuckoo's Nest being shut down in late 1981. In this abbreviated paper, I want to use my time to contextualize how country music in this time and place encapsulated precisely what hardcore punk rock in Orange County was rebelling against, which was suburbanism and Reagan-era conservatism. I'll briefly survey how country music became the sound of the suburbs by this time period and why Orange County in particular is one of the best case studies for understanding this evolution, and what role the country music industry in Nashville played in defining and targeting their listeners as white suburbanites. Now, by 1980, Orange County stood at the forefront of a wave of conservatism that had recently overtaken national politics and popular culture. That year, and again in 1984, Orange County voted more heavily for Reagan than any other county of its size nationally. Though the region's overwhelming conservatism was increasingly challenged by the emergence of hardcore punk rock in that area by the late 1970s, this resistance was emboldened further with Reagan's election. As historian Dewar McLeod has explained in his book, Kids of the Black Hole, Reagan's election in 1980 was key to energizing hardcore punk, saying that this was not only because punks opposed his conservative politics, but because here was an enemy with a face. By the late 1970s, no genre of music defined Orange County's conservative character more than country music. At the time, few areas outside Texas celebrated the urban cowboy craze with greater vigor. The country and western flavor has definitely hit Orange County, declared a cover story for Orange Coast magazine, which was Orange County's regional magazine, or is, in November of 1980. So November of 1980, the same month that Reagan is elected, there's a cover story on the cover of Orange Coast magazine reporting on the popularity of the urban cowboy craze and country music in Orange County. By the end of the year of 1980, hundreds of bars and nightclubs in Orange County alone considered themselves country and western. For punk rockers, the overwhelming presence of country music and the urban cowboy fad was unavoidable. The world was so redneck at the time, explained Casey Royer, singer of the punk band DI. Orange County's embrace of the urban cowboy craze was part of a longer legacy of country music and cowboy culture in Southern California, as Peter LaChapelle has shown us most significantly in his book, Proud to be an Okie. By the 1970s, country music had enjoyed decades of popularity in Southern California, which just very briefly included the presence of Capitol Records in LA since the 1940s, which by the 60s and 70s was recording Merle Haggard and Glenn Campbell. Also the country music variety show Town Hall Party, which was taped in Compton in the 1950s in South LA. And of course, Nudie Cone of the famous Bedazzled Nudie Suits was working out of his shop in North Hollywood. But while much of country music's consumption and production was centered in LA in the post-World War II period, increasingly the music was enjoyed outside of the city and became more established in nearby suburbs by the 1970s. Disneyland began regularly booking country acts in the mid-60s, and between 1950 and 1970, country music clubs moved from being concentrated in city centers to suburban areas like South LA and North Orange County, which is where Costa Mesa is located. So not only did country music have a long legacy of popularity in Southern California, but it had also earned a uniquely suburban appeal by the 1970s. During a period of white flight in the post-World War II decades, country music shared a story of social mobility with millions of white, blue-collar migrants, including Okies, who moved to the suburbs and overcame marginality defined by class and ethnicity. Like these migrants, country music, long ridiculed as hillbilly music, and associated with a lowbrow type of whiteness, increasingly gained mainstream respectability by the 1960s and 70s. So as Okies achieved respectability through suburban homeownership, so too did their music of choice become respectable and popular within mainstream music tastes. In Nashville, the center of the country music industry, business leaders worked consciously to brand country as a sound of suburbanism and move the genre away from its associations with poor, rural Southern whites. Regardless of one's upbringing, the country music industry nevertheless branded the affluent white suburbanite of the post-World War II decades as a prime and coveted demographic by the 1960s. At an influential marketing presentation in 1965 by the Country Music Association, or the CMA, country music was presented as a genre intended for suburban consumption to thousands of advertising executives. During this presentation, CMA President Tex Ritter spoke of strategies that could be implemented to, quote, retain the suburban audience and introduce performers like the Anita Kerr Singers by saying this talented group demonstrates some of their urban sounds with suburban songs. In 1967, the popular songwriter John D. Loudermilk expressed his understanding of country music's regionality by releasing his Grammy-winning album, Suburban Attitudes in Country Verse. By the 1970s, the idea that country music was meant for suburban consumption was commonplace and went far beyond the calls of Nashville. In 1977, one article declared that country music had fully moved to the suburbs, saying, quote, "Middle America now has 2 cars, two television sets, and 2 Johnny Cash albums. Country music, nurtured in Appalachia, has crept out of the shacks and into the suburbs." Now, also by the 1970s, country music not only stood as a symbol of suburbanism, but conservatism and patriotism. This is something that President Nixon capitalized on in the early 1970s, identifying country music fans as the silent majority, as his voting base, and actively courting them. And this is a demographic that President Reagan continued to capitalize on throughout his presidency in the 1980s. And likewise, the country music industry in Nashville saw use in latching itself to these presidents. And with Reagan, they collaborated with him on a number of key events throughout his terms in office. So by the time country music fans and punk rockers collided in the early 1980s, country music strongly stood as a symbol antithetical to hardcore punk in many ways. Proudly suburban, definitive of Reagan voters, and of course, anti-youth. These confrontations also remain significant in that they foreshadowed a broader cultural clash within popular music throughout the 1980s, which pitted country music defined as the sound of conservatism and wholesomeness against more youthful popular music, which was viewed as corrupting and a target for censorship by conservative groups like the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center, in much the same way that had been done in Costa Mesa, where punk rock was suppressed with the violent aid of country music fans that resulted in the closure of the Cuckoo's Nest in 1981. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Amanda. And last but certainly not least, we have Joseph Thompson. Joseph Thompson is assistant professor of history at Mississippi State University. His forthcoming manuscript, Sounding Southern: Music, Militarism, and the Making of the Sun Belt, traces the economic and symbolic connections between the country industry and the U.S. Defense Department during the Cold War. I can also say again, this is going to be a game changer, so be on the lookout. His work has appeared in the journals Southern Cultures and American Quarterly, as well as the edited collection Reconsidering Southern Labor History. And today, Joseph Thompson will bring us GI Blues, the military roots of country's teenage rebellion.
All right, thanks, Charles, and thanks to Amanda and to David and Julie, and to Karen, too, for keeping this ball rolling, even as we move to the virtual realm here. It's a pleasure to get to do this. All right, I should also say that's an old bio, so I've changed the name of the book. It's going to be called Cold War Country, but so there you go. All right, I'm getting into it here. All right, it was 1956, and Harold Jenkins headed for Memphis as soon as he received his discharge from the Army. He had heard Elvis Presley and hoped that he, too, could record for Sam Phillips' Sun Records. For the past 2 years, Jenkins had honed his skills as a singer, songwriter, and performer by fronting an all-soldier country band that matched Presley's style. They called themselves the Fuji Mountain Boys at first and played for soldier concerts and armed forces radio programs in Japan. Jenkins claimed he had written songs and performed all his life, but reflected that really, quote, things started to happen when I was in the Army in Japan. Phillips declined to offer Jenkins a contract, but the producer liked the Army vet's songs enough that Roy Orbison recorded one called Rock House that Sun released as a single. Jenkins rebounded quickly, of course, changed his name to Conway Twitty, and went to Nashville where he cut his first hit, It's Only Make Believe. No one could blame Twitty for heading to Memphis after his tour of duty. By 1956, the city had earned a reputation for launching a new musical trend, eventually called rockabilly, that fused elements of country and R&B and excited young fans across the country. Compared to Nashville's version of country music stardom, rockabilly performers seemed rebellious, dangerous, and wild. The music sounded fast, electric, sexy, and young. It was the teenage riot that got Roy Acuff out of bed. Part of that uproar started because of how rockabilly reflected and encouraged the shifting constructions of race and white supremacy. In contrast to the segregationists of the era, rockabilly artists, most notably Elvis Presley, betrayed an embrace of black culture in their musical and visual styles, even while laws and social conventions insisted that they maintain their distance from actual African Americans. Some country musicians expressed their distaste for Elvis with racial slurs. Others used more coded language. One prominent country music disc jockey complained how, quote, Elvis's contribution to American society is he gave America's youth permission to be sexual. That's all. Charlie Louvin, who toured with Presley, and lamented how, quote, people like Webb Pierce, who had 25 number ones, went down the drain. And the music changed so much that it seemed like it was a terrible slump for our kind of music. So it did get lean. Rockabilly's youthful rebellion shared a common yet under-acknowledged cause, the U.S. Armed Forces. In 1948, the military began its incremental and sometimes reluctant march towards desegregating the ranks. This directive placed black and white service members in close proximity as they trained, fought, and policed the world during the Cold War. White and black Southerners found themselves living closely with each other in ways that were unthinkable in civilian life. For musicians in the Army, that could also mean sharing a stage or a jam session with performers of a different race. These interracial, homosocial spaces created an incubator of creativity for the aspiring country musicians who briefly pushed the sounds of blackness to the forefront of country music. Elvis Presley's guitarist, Scotty Moore, along with Sun Records label mates Billy Lee Riley, Johnny Cash, Sonny Burgess, Charlie Rich, Sun producers Cowboy Jack Clement, and Stan Kessler, and Jim Stewart, founder of Memphis's soul label Stax Records, all used their time in the military to work on their craft as country musicians. And after serving, they all landed in Memphis to chase hillbilly stardom. The military provided these aspiring country musicians with two things. It gave them the time and the place to develop their craft as songwriters, singers, and performers, and it broadened their view of the world, opening their ears to the possibilities of incorporating musical influences across the color line that segregated civilian society. Scotty Moore joined the U.S. Navy in 1948 at age 16 and served for 40 years on missions that took him around the world. Born to a poor farming family in Gadsden, Tennessee, Moore dropped out of high school. He had lived in relative racial isolation among his white friends and family, but in the Navy, Moore served as a fireman among an integrated crew on a supply boat that sailed up and down the Yellow River during the Chinese Revolution. There, he began honing his guitar skills and all the downtime he had while not working in the engine room. Before joining, Moore had been riding his horse to high school, but at age 17, he helped power a ship for the U.S. government, ate, slept, and showered alongside African-American sailors, and enjoyed the pleasures of shore leave in Shanghai. The ship also offered a chance to collaborate with other musicians. Moore recalled how he fell in with fellow sailors in informal jam sessions. Quote, well, they were just 3 or 4 guys from different parts of the country, and we got together somehow or another. Somebody said, hey, somebody in such and such division plays piano or plays guitar or something, and eventually everybody would get together and whiled away the hours. His Navy buddy, Frank Parise, remembered Moore's playing in more detail, including an interracial collaboration. Moore played guitar, Parise played harmonica, and an unnamed black sailor sang. One such jam resulted in Moore's first recording in the ship's radio shack. So by the time Moore received his discharge in January 1952, are you still there? Okay, sorry, my phone started ringing. So by the time Moore received his discharge in January 1952, he had spent countless hours practicing guitar below deck, learning to collaborate with other players, and participated in an interracial recording session. He briefly returned to the farm, but then left for Memphis, where he formed the Starlight Wranglers with Bill Black on bass. Maybe the most well-known military to Sun Records connection is that of Johnny Cash. Cash remembered that he ended up in the military the same way that most Southern country boys did, for lack of a better way out of the cotton fields. That's it. Those are his words. And like Scotty Moore, joining the military provided Cash with the opportunity to develop his craft as a musician. He bought his first guitar, wrote his first songs, and formed his first band, all while overseas. It also meant that the Air Force dropped Cash into its newly integrated ranks. He remembered watching in shock as a fight broke out between black and white airmen in West Germany not long after he arrived in the country. Quote, "I looked down and there they were, whites and blacks, tearing at each other with everything they had." Cash attributed the fight in part to military training in close quarters. He argued, quote, "You had a lot of men, black and white, who'd been very strongly encouraged to kill people, then jam-packed together and told to behave like gentlemen. They were a boiler waiting to explode." Cash's fellow Arkansan and future Sun Records artist Sonny Burgess also landed in West Germany after the U.S. Army drafted him in 1951. Burgess, who had already started playing around his hometown of Newport, furthered his skills in the Army. After his basic training, he quickly fell in with a group that performed every Friday and Saturday night on the Armed Forces Radio Network. Burgess returned to Arkansas and reformed his old band in 1954 and spent the next 2 years playing a repertoire that mixed the country songs of Lefty Frizzell with the blues tunes of Jimmy Reed. By 1956, they were recording at Sun Studio, cutting songs like We Want a Boogie and Red-Headed Woman that defined the sounds of rockabilly. I could go through similar stories here for Billy Lee Riley or Stan Kessler or Conway Twitty and several more, but I'll stop with these examples for the sake of time. Now, all of these white performers who were eventually tagged as rock and roll or rockabilly started out as aspiring country musicians, and they all started out or were professionalized as musicians in the military. Now, obviously, I'm ignoring the big E in the room here. In December 1957, the U.S. Army broke its news to the nation that they wanted Elvis Presley as an enlisted man. 3 young women from Montana wrote to President Eisenhower with an urgent plea on the draftee's behalf. "You don't know how we feel about him," they testified. "I really don't see why you have to send him in the Army at all, but we beg you, please, please don't give him a GI haircut. Oh, please, please don't. If you do, we will just about die." And they signed their letter, Elvis Presley Lovers. For these young women, the stifling conformity of military service seemed something like a death sentence to their rebellious idol. They took exception to what they saw as an abuse of government power when Presley finally entered the Army in March 1958. But what these young women failed to understand was that there was, in fact, nothing exceptional about the star's military service. As a high school educated white male and the son of working class parents from the margins of polite white society, Presley likely expected to serve in the armed forces at some point. He even seemed to consider the military as a career opportunity, joining the ROTC program for 2 years at Humes High School. Of course, those young women weren't considering the Cold War political economy of the South's working class when they registered their protest with the commander-in-chief. Nor were they considering how the U.S. Armed Forces had helped give birth to the very music that rocked their record collection. But they were right to voice their fears. Military service did quell the teenage rebellion within country music, as it was embodied by Elvis. At 23 years old, with 14 gold records and 4 film credits, Presley's whole world seemed to vanish before his eyes when he was drafted. And in a way it did. The Presley who embodied conspicuous sexuality, the possibility of racial mixing, and rebellion within the ranks of Music Row had disappeared. When he emerged from the Army 2 years later, Presley appeared to have conducted one of the most striking transformations in the history of American popular music, from punk to patriot. In doing so, Elvis secured his spot as a pop star and matinee idol. Music Row could then breathe a sigh of relief. The armed forces might have helped create a space for musicians to woodshed and soak in an array of influences, but under the right circumstances, it could subdue a riot, and Roy Acuff could go back to bed. Thanks. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all to all of our great presenters. And yeah, I definitely want to echo the thanks to Karen Thompson, who I believe is here somewhere, and also to our PopCon Zoom tech person, who has been really, really helpful. Thank you so much. So we do have some time. The chat has not been too busy, but so if you have a question, if you either want to kind of raise your hand in one way or another, or throw it in there, I will do my best to monitor. Not everyone's on the same screen, but I see Stacy has their hand up, so go for it.
Am I?
Yep.
Okay. This is really simple, Joey, but Teenage Riot is like the Sonic Youth is a Roy Acuff cover.
Sonic Youth has a Roy Acuff cover?
Like Teenage Riot, I didn't know the origin of the
Yeah,
word.
that was just my own little joke to myself as I was writing.
I was like, sorry, I was like super surprised by. I thought you were saying the Sonic Youth song was a cover of something that I didn't know.
No, it's just my own little joke to myself.
It's a good joke.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it really landed.
I have a question for Amanda. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So Amanda, you were talking about this phenomenon at the beginning of the 1980s, the relationship between, in that particular scene, punks and people into country, or specifically urban cowboy. But I was thinking about, I mean, by the next decade, by the 90s, there were so many examples of people who were steeped in punk that were kind of circling back to, or in some ways reclaiming, at least particular country artists or particular flavors of country that they deemed as authentic. And then ultimately, you know, even the sort of recasting or reframing of Johnny Cash as a punk icon on the American recordings. So I just wonder, you know, what you make of that, how that continued to play out and sort of seem to, in some ways, kind of spin back around in certain ways.
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. And that's something that's in the longer version of this for sure. Thinking about, you know, bands like Social Distortion, you know, by the late 80s that were covering Kitty Wells, you know, on a major record label. So yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a fascinating component of it. And also I think just thinking about, you know, the racial component, you know, both being like, I mean, recent scholarship has definitely challenged the idea that punk rock was like just only music for white youth. But in the context of Orange County, it was a predominantly, you know, type of music that white teenagers listened to. But yeah, I think it's interesting to draw a lot of the kind of similarities there. And with punk rock, I mean, it was a form of self-marginalization, but, you know, just as soon as you could be a punk rocker with red hair walking down the street and getting beaten up, it wasn't soon after that, you know, there were attempts to commodify punk rock. And within a handful of years, by the end of the 80s into the early 90s, you know, you have things like Vans Warped Tour or Hot Topic. So I think it is really fascinating to think about how both country music and punk rock kind of started with a kind of marginalized whiteness that increasingly gained respectability. So I just think of the kind of racial commonalities between the two when thinking about, like, yeah, you know, there's so much of punk rock by the late 80s and afterwards that's kind of paying homage to country music.
All right, I think Paula, you've had your hand up for a while. Oh, hold on.
Thank you. I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
This is also for Amanda, kind of to follow up on what Julie was talking about. Have you explored the presence of right-wing extremist punk in the 1970s and 80s in Orange County specifically? Because I know that Marlene Rios Hernandez is doing some work with Alice Bag about right-wing punk in Orange County versus Southeast LA punk in Los Angeles, and how that affects the relationship of punk and country music in Orange County as well.
I haven't, but can you repeat who that individual was? Because I definitely.
Yeah, I'll put her name in the chat so you can look her up. She is I'm pretty sure she's already graduated, but she did a dissertation project on Southeast LA punk at University of California, Riverside.
Okay.
And specifically talks about right-wing punk in Orange County affecting that. Have you come across any of that with your research with country music? Because it seems really interesting, especially with the racial discrepancies in those two genres.
Have I come across it in country music in what form? Sorry?
Country music and that aspect of punk music in Orange County. Have you come across it at all?
I haven't. My research centers on the industry in Nashville. So yeah, I haven't explored it that deeply within Orange County, but it sounds super fascinating. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I think we've got Jesse, and then I see Carl also, and we got a couple others. So I'll do best. But I think Jesse's going to start with us first.
Is my mic working? Oh, hey, Joey. I had a question for Joey. I was just curious. I don't know what the end point in terms of period is for your project, but I was curious if you had thoughts on like what the shift to an all volunteer army, what effect that might have on, I don't know, the sort of processes you're working through and like the dropping away of the draft and the kind of distance between civilian life and army life that begins in the early 70s there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. How's it going, Jesse? Nice to see you. Yeah, so country music, as a lot of people here probably know, besides these kinds of social history of music in the ranks, I'm also writing about country music as a recruitment tool. And you definitely see the continued usage of country music as a recruitment tool through the 70s and 80s after the shift to an all-volunteer force. Although I also think you see the Defense Department moving away from country music as they recognize that the demographics of the Army are changing, and it becomes, there's a historian named Jennifer Middlestad who's written about the Army as essentially just an extension of the welfare state, right? And so as it becomes part more as serving in the armed forces becomes more of a part of the social safety net, then the demographics are changing, right? In some respects, the Army branding, though, still clings to country music as an image anyways, and that's certainly propelled after 1984 by Lee Greenwood. But then you also see the Army shifting into other media outlets, so the NFL, and then eventually first-person shooter games, which is a big topic right now, right? So what's the connection with my work there? I think that their relationship with country music and the way that they see their ability to reach specific demographics through media actually kind of sets a precedent for the way that they do that through other media outlets, whether it's sports or video games. So I think in a way the country music kind of sets a mold for that. Now, I haven't looked at the kind of ground up history of musicians playing in the all volunteer force the way I have during the 50s, but that would be interesting to find out. Thanks.
All right, and I think we have Carl and then JD.
Hey, you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, this kind of crosses a few of the things we've been talking about, but it's a question for David. Just in terms of the exclusion of like youth culture content from country, I'm struck by the conversation that we've had in the different papers of the way that genre crossover relates to that. And so if you think about like rockabilly followed by both outlaw and country rock in the 70s, and then we were touching on cowpunk and alt country, there's this kind of dance where, and it's not, and those aren't always entirely separate worlds, certainly not in the case of rockabilly. And so I just wondered, David, like if you have an idea of like where that sort of passage between genres might be, where some of that youth content gets negotiated.
Yeah, I don't know about the negotiation of the content. Like my initial sort of just reaction to the examples you use is that the rockabilly example is an instance where there's a youth invasion that's right on country radio, right? And but the outlaw movement is embraced by youth culture, but the actual participants, I would argue, are falling in the same kinds of grown-ass themes and concerns and performers as honky tonk, for example. And it's also another example of how passé sounds have become more familiar and safer and move into outlaw, which is one of the things that lets them cross over too. But so I suppose that's a kind of negotiation, because now the old people have adopted the young thing. But my sense, particularly with country, is that stuff is that the audience drives the music more. The audience drives the changes more than the other way around. And maybe that's different than in other genres, but that the outlaw can succeed precisely because so many changes have already been accepted into the country audience, like long hair and just all those old rock and roll people who are now grown up. That's probably not answering your question.
Okay, JD?
Okay, can you hear me or see me?
Can hear you and see you.
Okay, this is also a question for David, and it has to do with the use of melisma, which I recognize in the context of your talk how it was kind of radical, but the thing that I wonder about is how would you compare that to the sort of blue yodel that
right.
Yeah, because that was vocally very much a similar sound and technique.
It's a related one, and in fact that's the way that so I was talking about Daniel Cooper, Frizzell's biographer, and he talks about this this moment. He identifies a couple of moments when Frizzell is specifically influenced by Black performers. The one is the one I mentioned in my paper, where for months he apparently woodshedded with the R&B hits of the day. But the other one was when he's a young man and he kept sneaking off on Sundays when he should have been in church, and they finally found that he had located an old Black tenant farmer. And as in most of these kinds of stories with country acts, the actual name of the human being has been lost, or it was never known. But he was going there to get guitar lessons from this man. So that's an interesting, part of the Frizzell story that, again, shows him being profoundly influenced by Black music. But that's not the way the Frizzell story gets told. But what Cooper does do is he says that in his reading, Frizzell was a huge Jimmy Rogers fan. It's kind of interesting because by the time that that Frizzell is coming up, Jimmy Roger records are kind of hard to find, and he's fallen out of fashion. But his dad was a hardcore fan and had the records. And so he grew up listening to those records. And Cooper spins it that the melisma Frizzell was using was actually taking some of the blue yodel techniques, but instead of using it as a tag on the end of the chorus, was inserting it into verses in ballad rather than of the blues style, right? And I was just writing about this the other day, and I love that. It makes sense to me, and it also seems it's a delightful way of sort of thinking that what he's really doing is each of those melismas is a tiny little blue yodel popped in at various points to Frizzell's phrasing. But I think that's definitely part of the equation, definitely. But I also think that that was something that he my guess, my speculation, I haven't heard anyone else ever talk about this or make this leap, but my sense is that he was hearing something that was becoming more prominent on R&B, in R&B hits in that moment. And he uses it in the same way. Like today, when we think of melismatic singers, we think of someone who, like, you know, if they're going to use melisma, like from the first line, and because they use it every line and maybe every word. But this is the old school melisma, where it's not simply, and I don't mean just splitting the note in two, which all singers do everywhere and all times, but taking the one syllable and making it into 3, 4, or more syllables. And that's what the R&B singers were beginning to do. And like Frizzell, what they did was they didn't do it all through the song. They picked a moment, they picked their spot where it would have emotional impact or had rhythmic fun. But they were still singing more non-melismatically, predominantly. But these moments pop out. And I think they probably pop, my sense is that they pop then even more, because today we're so used to singers using melisma all the time. And then when it happened, that accounts for the country music audience's, I think, reaction that, wow, this is weird and strange and cool, in a way that the Black audience wouldn't have even had for R&B singers, because they were at least familiar with that singing style.
Can I ask David another question? David, you've given us Lefty Frizzell to think of in a little bit different way, to consider that, he would have been heard as being explicitly youthful, doing something new in that sort of way. When you were working on this, did you think of any other performers who also had that sort of perception attached to them, early on, that we wouldn't just automatically think of?
Florida Georgia Line. Is that one?
That is not where I was going with that.
No, but I'm serious. But I think a lot of, so I don't need to tell the people on this panel that, and the people I can see as well, that, country music is influenced by Black musicians, but it tends to get influenced by older Black music that's, that's out of fashion or just past its peak. But one of the things that's been happening in Nashville this decade, especially this last half decade, right, is the borrowings are closer to now that white Nashville musicians are using.
They hadn't caught up just yet when Florida Georgia Line came on the scene, but yes, since then it has been speeding up a bit. Yes,
but I think most of the time it's there's that delay, and
Hey, can I raise my hand? Is there a way to talk about the use of autotune as the new melisma then, as the kind of signal to youth culture? Is that a way to bring Julie and David's together here?
Well, I was thinking, it was funny. So the record that Frizzell was listening to that's specified in his biography is Ivy Joe Hunter's "I Almost Lost My Mind." And when I was listening to the Florida Georgia Line autotune, it reminded me of the way Ivy Joe Hunter sings, "I almost lost my mind," and which is not a yodel, and it's not really melisma, and it's not autotune, but everything new is old. So Julie, do you have anything to say? I was going to ask Joey a question.
I would just add that I can't recall the first single that I heard auto-tune very noticeably used on. I mean, I was gesturing toward the use of auto-tune on that song, as until the remix, it was not an in-your-face use of auto-tune. It was more in line with the original intended use of auto-tune, just to perfect the note, and as they were holding it out to make sure that it stayed perfectly on pitch. Obviously, the remix, they really leaned into the auto-tune, but I do remember it was used before then in Nashville on other singles, and I remember it felt belated when I first heard it. It felt belated as a technique
but it felt as though it was, you know, intended to kind of point to, oh, we're doing something super current. We're doing something, we're really, you know, we're really going out on a limb. That's how, you know, that felt like the intention, like, oh, we're pushing the envelope here, but it was already, you know, well behind the curve, the use of it.
Carl just commented something similar to that, there's a delay. As I was saying, there's usually a delay, and that there was less of a delay in this recent moment, but as Carl points out, it's still a delay. It's still running behind the cutting edge.
Yeah, I'm doing some other work right now about the actual hip hop and R&B scenes in Nashville, and the fact that there is, you know, a pretty well-developed independent yet underground scene that has not been tapped into at all by the people that are, you know, using programming and beat making techniques and the track people.
And David, you had a question for Julie? We're getting near the end of our time, but if you have a question for Julie, go for it.
Real quick, it was kind of more of just what do you think of this take? So I wanted to push back a little bit gently on the idea that once Elvis came out of the Army, he was neutered and no longer inducing riots or no longer seen as a threat. And I think that's the traditional narrative. I would make it that he gets to that place pretty quickly in the 60s, but the Elvis is Back album and all that stuff is still in the same, so much of that is still in the same sonic world that he was in before. And so maybe part of what has happened is not just that Elvis has been, you know, controlled in some way, but that while he's in the service, country itself has changed. Country music and rock and roll have changed. The entire genre has been neutered. And so it's not that his performance changed so much, at least in his initial comeback, but that the audience perception of it had changed.
That's a good point, and that's something I should think more about and incorporate. The way that I kind of gauge that for myself in the work is that before he goes in, the Army is saying, well, there are speculations that Elvis will be used for recruitment, or he'll be put into special services, so he'll just be an entertainer, right? And that says no, we don't want him. From what we see, his audience is, you know, teenage girls, and that's not who we are interested in. So we don't want him as a recruitment tool. But then he gets out, and by 1961 they've released GI Blues, and that's with the full cooperation of the Pentagon, and it's essentially a giant recruitment film. So I guess that's what I'm looking at. But thinking about the way country has changed in that 2-year span is a great point. I'll have to.
Yeah, well, but GI Blues is a great example of what you're arguing. That's exactly the argument. Yeah.
Right. Thanks.
Well, all right, we are past our time. So if it's all right with everyone, I think we might call it here. Thank you all so much. Let's give another round of applause of whatever sort to our panelists and to everyone involved in this wonderfully successful first day of virtual PopCon. It's happening. It's happening. I hope you all will be back with us tomorrow and in the days and weeks to come. It's wonderful to see some faces that I have been missing and meet some new friends as well. So thank you again to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a good night, and we'll see y'all soon.